This is your host, Danny, and welcome to a new episode from English Plus Podcast. Today's episode is about our series 100 Events That Changed the World, and we will continue with Event 81 to Event 90. So we still have one episode to go after this one, of course, but let me tell you about the events we're going to talk about in today's episode. We will start with the Dalai Lama of Tibet going into exile. Then we will continue talking about the Cold War and the Berlin Wall. After that, we will talk about Kennedy's assassination that starts civil unrest. After this, we will talk about the apartheid protester enters prison. And of course, we're talking about Nelson Mandela here. After this one, we're going to talk about the first heart transplant success that raises a lot of questions. And after this one, Event 86, ATM, taking over leads to a new way of banking. And after that, we're going to talk about the Iranian Shah who throws a bash for ancient monarchy. Event 88 is Pong, the inventor of Pong that launches video game craze. And then we will talk about the horror of Cambodia's killing fields. And finally, we will talk about Event 90, and that is the build-it-yourself kit that starts the PC revolution. So, are you interested? We're going to talk about all these events in today's episode. Join me in this episode, and we will start with the very first one, talking about the exile of the Dalai Lama. Well, this first event happened in 1959. Tenzin Gyatso, who was born in 1935, was Tibet's 14th Dalai Lama. He became the head of Tibet's government in 1950. Just a year later, Chinese troops occupied Tibet. In 1959, Chinese officials tried to take land owned by temples, and an uprising broke out. The Dalai Lama was forced into exile in India, where he still lives as Tibet's spiritual leader working toward the liberation of his homeland. The Chinese Cultural Revolution, which took place from 1966 to 1969, forced Tibetan monks from monasteries, and the Red Guards demolished their temples. After Mao Zedong's death in 1976, Deng Xiaoping softened the communist stance. He allowed Tibetans to practice their own religion and rebuild temples to promote their culture. In the 1980s, the Dalai Lama and the communists attempted to resolve their differences, but after political protests in Tibet in 1987 and 1989, Tibet was placed under martial law to stifle dissent. Recently, China has begun modernizing Tibet, funding education programs and building a rail line to connect the capital, Lhasa, to industrial cities like Beijing. Many Tibetans believe these acts are China's way to supplant their culture and the Dalai Lama's influence. Protests have become violent, including shocking images of monks lighting themselves on fire, and don't seem to be coming to an end despite on and off peace talks since 2000. So that was our first event in today's episode. What about the second event, the Cold War and the Berlin Wall? Well, that happened in 1961. In February 1945, Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Yalta Agreement, which outlined the rights of nations to determine their political destiny after World War II. However, despite this, the Soviets used both political and military measures to insert communist regimes in Eastern Europe, Asia, and Latin America. From 1945 to 1991, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union raged. The United States, determined to contain the spread of communism, was successful in Korea, Guatemala, and Chile, but floundered in Vietnam and Cuba. The Soviets found allies in the Middle East and suppressed any surge toward democracy in the countries of Eastern Europe behind the so-called Iron Curtain. Most alarmingly, the two superpowers began competing in a nuclear arms race, building hundreds of thousands of weapons between them. The Cold War came to a head in Germany when the Berlin Wall was raised overnight on August the 12th, 1961. Initially built by Eastern Germany to stop citizens from fleeing to non-communist West Germany, it became a symbol of repression. The wall fell in 1989 along with the end of the arms race, and in 1990 the Charter of Paris was adopted, which proclaimed that all 32 signatories, including the United States and Soviet Union, would nurture democracy and peace within their borders. So that was about the Berlin Wall. What about the 83rd event that changed the history of the world? That is about Kennedy's assassination that starts civil unrest. That happened in 1963. On November the 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot to death by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, Texas. 5 months earlier, on June the 11th, JFK had proposed the Civil Rights Act in a televised speech. Many wondered if he had been killed because of his support of civil rights, especially since his death was the first of several assassinations targeting civil rights leaders, including JFK's brother Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X. The assassinations underscored the unrest within the nation. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who took office after Kennedy's death, tried to address the social strife and eliminate poverty and racial injustice through his Great Society program. He signed the Civil Rights Act into law in 1964 after Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech galvanized the country. But as U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War grew, so did more political unrest. In 1970, in Bethel, New York, 400,000 youths gathered for Woodstock, a music festival symbolic of 1960s counterculture. A year later, 4 unarmed students were shot at Kent State University by the Ohio National Guard, which led to a strike of 4 million youths. It would take another 4 years after the United States withdrew from Vietnam and the elimination of the military draft for the student protests to end. So that was about Kennedy's assassination. Let's move to another part of the world, to South Africa to be specific, and let's talk about the apartheid protester entering prison. And here we're talking about Nelson Mandela. That happened in 1964. Apartheid, or apartness in Afrikaans, became law in South Africa in 1948. It was a policy of the racial segregation imposed by the white minority government that institutionalized discrimination against black people through unequal wages, physical violence, physical segregation, and lack of political representation. Nelson Mandela, who lived between 1917 and 2013, who became a leading anti-apartheid activist, was born into the royal family of the Tembu tribe. Groomed for leadership at an early age, he became a lawyer and then a leader of the African National Congress, or the ANC, which was dedicated to establishing a free and democratic society. Charged with sabotage, treason, and conspiracy to overthrow the government, Mandela was imprisoned on June the 12th, 1964, galvanizing anti-apartheid activists around the world. 27 years later, on February the 11th, 1990, Prime Minister F.W. de Klerk legalized the ANC and released the world's most famous political prisoner. Apartheid officially ended in 1994 when Nelson Mandela was elected President of South Africa. As president, he established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which investigated abuses by both supporters and opponents of apartheid between 1960 and 1994. Mandela's insistence on the commission's transparency and on hearing testimony from both victims and perpetrators was groundbreaking. So that was about Nelson Mandela. Now let's move to something scientific that happened in 1967, and it did change the history of the world. And here we're talking about the first heart transplant success. But that raised questions, of course. That happened in 1967. Dr. Christian Barnard, a South African cardiac surgeon, performed the world's first successful human heart transplant in 1967. The surgery took place at Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town, South Africa. Working with a team that included self-taught black South African Hamilton Naki, Barnard placed the donor heart from a young female victim of a fatal car accident into the chest of 55-year-old Louis Washkansky, who suffered from heart failure. He lived for 18 days before dying of an infection. Barnard's surgery received worldwide attention. The response was mixed. Some considered it an attempt to play God. Others approved. 2 years after Barnard's success, Norwegian immunologist Jean-François Borel discovered cyclosporine, which suppresses the immune system against foreign tissue and aids transplant success. By 1984, roughly 80% of transplant patients survive 2 or more years. Today, scientists in the emerging field of regenerative medicine are using human cells, including controversial stem cells, to regrow organs. Scientists doing stem cell research, much of which does not use the debated human embryo cells, have been able to create mini organs such as liver buds, which function the same way the entire organ does. Human implantation of liver buds may even be possible by 2025. So, that was about the heart transplant, but that was only the first 5 events that I want to talk about in this episode. We still have 5 more events to go. And let me continue right away with the 86th event, the ATM. And here we're talking about banking. We moved from politics to science to banking to money to economics. But here we're just talking about the ATM, which is something very common nowadays, but it was not all the time. It was definitely a new thing in 1967. But everybody knows that it is the new way of banking. So let's talk about when that happened in 1967. When the banking industry's automated teller machine, or ATM, came of age in 1970, it drastically changed the way people did business with banks, institutions that had existed since Assyrian merchants made grain loans to farmers and traders around 2000 BC. Banking in the modern sense of the word originated in Italy during the early Renaissance, from 1300 to 1700, in the wealthy cities of Florence, Venice, and Genoa. The most famous was perhaps the Medici Bank, founded in 1397. A decade later, a group of nobles in Genoa established Casa di San Giorgio, the first public bank. Investors bought shares in the bank, and the bank protected its investors by distinguishing between unforgivable and forgivable, or acts of God, loan defaults, credit checks, tax collection, and public bank accounts. During the next 200 years, banking spread from Italy throughout Europe. By the late 16th century, the traditional roles of banks, accepting deposits, transferring funds, lending and changing money, were combined with issuing bank debt as a substitute for gold and silver coins. Banks also became an important source of funding for warring European states by the end of the 17th century, which led to government regulation and the first central banks. The number of banks grew during the Industrial Revolution, somewhere from the late 1700s to the early 1800s, as a result of increased international trade. New merchant banks handled financial transactions like bond underwriting and foreign loans. In the late 1700s, 2 immigrant families, Rothschild and Baring, launched merchant banking firms in London that dominated world banking for more than a century. During the Great Depression from 1929 to 1939, the industry nearly collapsed, but the New Deal created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insured bank accounts and restored Americans' faith in the system. In 1958, Bank of America issued the first credit card plan, Bank AmeriCard, which, unlike the American Express charge card issued that year, did not have to be paid off monthly. It was in 1967 that Scottish inventor John Shepherd Barron installed the first cash dispensing ATM at a London bank. It used chemically treated checks for account identification. A year later, American engineer Don Wetzel developed the magnetic strip cards and personal identification numbers, or PINs, which are still in use today, by the way. Industry estimates place the number of ATMs in use today at about 2.5 million globally. Their use has limited the need for human bankers, a trend that has only grown with online and mobile banking. Online trading, which was first introduced to the average investor in the 1980s, has also made investing more accessible, transparent, and less costly. So, that was the revolution of the ATM. Now, what's coming next? What is Event 87 in our today's episode? That's about the Iranian Shah, who throws a bash for ancient monarchy. That happened in 1971. In October 1971, the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who lived between 1941 to 1979, organized 4 days of elaborate festivities to mark the 2500th anniversary of the founding of the Iranian monarchy. At its height, the Achaemenid dynasty, founded by Cyrus the Great, somewhere between 600 and 530 BC, in 550 BC stretched from the Aegean Sea and Libya to the Indus Valley. For 1,000 years, beginning in 312 BC, the Seleucid, Parthian, and Sasanian empires governed Iran and returned it to a leading world power during the Roman and Byzantine empires. After Iran, which was then called Persia, fell to Islamic armies between 633 and 718 AD, the empire, which had practiced the Zoroastrian religion, adopted Islam. The achievements of its previous empires, however, were absorbed into the new Islamic civilization. Then, after a period of instability, a new Persian dynasty called the Safavid reunified Iran in 1501. The Safavid made Shia Islam the official state religion, and Iran was once again a leading power. Through the centuries, Iran had succeeded in creating a distinct political and cultural identity. But the monarchy would not last long after its glorious 1971 celebration. On April 1st, 1979, the Shah, who was viewed as corrupt and beholden to the West, was overthrown and the monarchy abolished. The country became an Islamic republic led by Ayatollah Khomeini, who lived from 1902 to 1989.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Looking to enhance your English skills while exploring a world of knowledge? Then English Plus Podcast website is just for you. Dive into diverse topics ranging from science to literature, history to business, and myths to modern insights. Each episode from our podcast or article from our magazine is a journey of learning and discovery, designed to not only improve your language skills, but also broaden your understanding of the world. Join us at English Plus Podcast, where language meets limitless learning. Tune in today and take your English to the next level. Visit EnglishPlusPodcast.com to start your journey. English Plus Podcast, language, learning, enlightenment. Never stop learning with English Plus. So that was the 87th event that changed the history of the world. What about the next event? What are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about something interesting, something a lot of you are interested in, and that is video games. But where did that start? Well, actually, maybe you don't know. Maybe some of you think it's Mario. Maybe some of you think it's Space Invaders. Or some of you who are not that old might think it's Candy Crush. But no, these are not the beginnings. Actually, the beginning was with Pong. Well, that's what we're going to talk about. That's our 88th event that changed the history of the world. And here we're talking about Pong inventor that launched what we call the video game craze. That happened in 1975. In 1972, American engineer Nolan Bushnell created Pong, the first video game. A childhood inventor, he had managed an amusement park as a teenager and studied computer graphics and engineering. Pong, which is a moving blip with knob-controlled paddles, was an arcade game inspired by the actual game of ping pong. Sensing a market for video games, Bushnell and electrical engineer Ted Dabney founded Atari in 1972 with $500. Atari entered into an agreement with Sears in 1975 to distribute the home version of Pong, marking the first interactive use of television sets. Having become a leader in arcade games, home video consoles, and home computers, Atari was sold to Warner Communications, now called Time Warner, for $28 million in 1977. At that price tag, it was clear Pong was just the start of a huge global industry worth more than $200 billion, which now includes video games for all kinds of high-performance platforms ranging from Xbox to Nintendo to PlayStation, and of course more are coming every day. So that was the 88th event, which was amusing and fun because all of us know video games, whether we like them or not, whether we play them or not. But then we're going to move to a tragic event, and that is the 89th event that changed the world. And here we're talking about the horror of Cambodia's killing fields. Well, that also happened in 1975. The Khmer Rouge regime, headed by Pol Pot, took control of Cambodia in April 1975. The Maoist guerrillas launched a campaign of terror, executing educated people, separating children from their parents, forcing people of all ages into work camps or the military, and trying to rid the country of all foreign influences, including books, medicine, and money. The Maoists idealized the peasant class and sought to revert Cambodia to a simple agrarian society. Pol Pot personified the monstrous dimensions of communist ideology. In the 4 years he ran Cambodia, its rice fields became mass graves. 1.7 million people were massacred. Some were executed, others died during forced marches to the countryside, and many more died from starvation. A horrifying example of internal cleansing. The Vietnamese removed the Khmer Rouge from power in 1979, although Pol Pot continued to lead guerrilla forces in the Cambodian jungles until his death in 1998. And now we come to the final event for today's episode, not the final event for the series. We still have 10 more events, and that's for the last episode of this series before we start a new series, of course. But what is the last event for today's episode? That is the PC revolution. Well, at least we move from that massacre to something a little bit, I'm not going to say happy or not, but something that we all know about. That also happened in 1975. It's not just the PC, it's the build-it-yourself kit. And that started the PC revolution. In 1834, English mathematician Charles Babbage envisioned an analytical engine, a forerunner to the modern electronic computer. His device would perform any mathematical function based on programming from punch cards and print the answer on paper. Babbage was never able to finance the development of his machine, but just more than a century later, 3 significant early computers were developed in the United States and Britain, making Babbage's vision a reality. In late 1943, code breakers at Bletchley Park began using an electronic computer called Colossus, designed by British engineer Tommy Flowers. The foundations for such digital computers, which process information using numbers, typically 0 and 1, had been laid in the 1930s by mathematicians like Britain's Alan Turing, who also served at Bletchley Park during World War II. Colossus demonstrated the strategic significance of this new technology by quickly solving problems expert code breakers had struggled with for weeks. The following year, IBM unveiled the Mark I, which became the world's first automatic computer. The Mark I could multiply in 5.7 seconds, divide in 15.3 seconds, and solve a logarithm or trigonometric function in just more than a minute. Though its speed is shoddy by today's standards, this large-scale digital calculator, the Automatic Sequence Controlled Calculator or the ASCC, pioneered the use of machines in science and applied mathematics. The world's first digital computer, INIAC or Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, was built in 1947 at the University of Pennsylvania. It was the size of a large room, weighed 30 tons, contained 18,000 vacuum tubes and 6,000 switches. and was used to perform calculations for physicists who were developing the hydrogen bomb. A few years later, in 1947, Bell Labs invented the transistor, which are tiny switches triggered by electric signals that are the basic building blocks of microchips. Combined with microchips, invented in 1971 by American engineer Robert Noyce and Jack Kilby, they allowed for faster, smaller, and more powerful computers, paving the way for the personal computing revolution. In the early 1970s, calculator manufacturer Ed Roberts marketed Altair, a 500 build-it-yourself computer kit. Altair was something of a sensation because it was the first computer built for home use. In 1975, Harvard student Bill Gates and programmer Paul Allen offered to improve Altair by using the computer language BASIC rather than its existing machine code, so users didn't have to program the machine themselves. They used a Harvard computer to develop the software and launch the new easy-to-use home computer industry. Bill Gates and Paul Allen went on to found Microsoft, which continues to dominate the software market today. Unable to afford an Altair, Steve Jobs and Steven Wozniak built their own computer, Apple I, in the Jobs family garage in 1976. After marketing it through small retailers, they introduced Apple II, which had color graphics. Their company grew faster than any other in American history. Apple has gone on to lead the industry in smaller and smaller computing devices, the iMac, iPad, iPhone, iPod, and in 2015, the first wearable computer, the iWatch. So, that was the PC revolution, and some of you might say the PC, that's Microsoft. No, it's not. It's just a personal computer. So, of course, it applies both to Microsoft and Apple, and they're two different companies anyway. But that's not the point. These are the 10 events that we talked about in today's episode. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you enjoyed the information I shared with you in today's episode. And before I leave you, let me remind you that English Plus Podcast is a free podcast. You can enjoy it anytime you want, with a new episode coming out every day. You're more than welcome to enjoy it as much as you want, but if you would like to contribute, you can become a patron. You can help us grow. There's a link to my Patreon page in the description of the episode, and there's also another link to a one-time donation or contribution, if you would like to call it, on Buy Me a Coffee. They're both in the description of the episode, but anyway, I'm very glad that you made it till here and you listened to the whole episode. This is your host, Danny. Thank you very much for listening to another episode from English Plus Podcast. I will see you next time.